Hi, welcome. I'm Carson, and this is the first recommendation in this new format, the new YouTube video format of For Art's Sake. And so before I actually tell you what film I'm going to be recommending this week, I actually want to begin with a completely, well, very tangential related story. I want to begin with this poster here. It's a poster for an exhibition that actually took place all around the world, especially across Europe. And it was called The 100 Years of Cinema. And it was an exhibition in 1995 that marked 100 years since the first public exhibition of a film in 1995 in France. And it was a huge exhibition sponsored by the European Union trying to celebrate this heritage of cinema, especially this European heritage cinema. And it was all around the world, touring across museums. But one man, Jonas Mekas, was very upset at this exhibition. And he wrote the following year this manifesto, Anti-100 Years of Cinema Manifesto, because he argued that, yes, this is this huge exhibition that people had spent millions on, and it was talking about supposedly all the great directors, the Orson Welles, and Francis Ford Coppola, and all those famous names. But he argued that what he saw as an equally, if not even more important part of film history, as to Orson Welles or George Lucas or Francis Ford Coppola, was completely omitted. And he wrote this brief but incredibly beautiful manifesto that perfectly introduces the kind of cinema that is rarely seen these days. It is rarely talked about. Very few people have an interest in it, but it deserves to be talked about. And indeed, if this was in-person screenings, there's actually, it's very difficult to show these films because they're also films that people tend to fall asleep for. The kind of cinema is avant-garde cinema. Now, to briefly introduce Jonas Mekas, who sadly died very recently, um, he's sometimes called the godfather of avant-garde cinema. He founded the foremost institution dedicated to preserving avant-garde cinema, which is Anthology Film Archives in New York. He made many impactful and important avant-garde films himself, and he also, helped others produce avant-garde films. He also founded an avant-garde film publication. So nonetheless, a really, really important figure. And he wrote this beautiful, towards the end of his life, right after most of his most important work had already been done. And then this big exhibition comes out in 1995, and he sees like none of this work that he spent his whole life career to promote is featured in it, despite it having influenced, so many directors, so many films. Avant-garde cinema is truly a cornerstone of cinema. Just because it's not seen by many, it is the absolute antithesis of popular cinema. Um, doesn't mean that it isn't important, because so many people who do make films do see these and they're inspired by them. Even though these are incredibly obscure, many of these are obscure, unpopular films. So I'm going to read for you the entirety of Jonas Mekas's Anti-100 Years of Cinema. As you well know start over. As you well know, it was God who created this earth and everything on it. And he thought it was all great. All painters and poets and musicians sang and celebrated the creation, and that was all okay. But not for real. Something was missing. So about 100 years ago, God decided to create the motion picture camera. And he did so. And then he created a filmmaker and said, now here's an instrument called the motion picture camera. Go and film and celebrate the beauty of the creation and the dreams of human spirit and have fun with it. But the devil did not like that. So he placed a money bag in front of the camera and said to the filmmakers, why do you want to celebrate the beauty of the world and the spirit of it if you can make money with this instrument? And believe it or not, all the filmmakers ran after the money bag. The Lord realized he had made a mistake. So, some 25 years later, to correct his mistake, God created independent avant-garde filmmakers and said, here is the camera. Take it and go into the world and sing the beauty of all creation and have fun with it. but you will have a difficult time doing it, and you will never make any money with this instrument. Thus spoke the Lord to, and I'm sorry if I butcher any of these names, he lists many, many avant-garde film directors, Viking Egling, Germain Dulac, Jean Epstein, Fernand Léger, Dmitry Kirsanov, Marcel Duchamp, Hans Richter, Louis Buñuel, Man Ray, Cavalcanti, Jean Cocteau, and Maya Deren, and Sidney Peterson, and Kenneth Anger, Gregory Markopoulos, Stan Brakhage, Marie Menken, Bruce Bailey, Francis Lee, Harry Smith, and Jack Smith, and Ken Jacobs, Ernie Gear, Ron Rice, Michael Snow, Joseph Cornell, Peter Kubelka, Hollis Frampton, and Barbara Rubin, Paul Sheretz, Robert Beavers, Christopher McLean, and Kurt Kren, Robert Breer, Dory O, Isidore Izu, Antonio de Bernardi, Maurice Lemaitre, and Bruce Connor, and Klaus Wyberny, and Boris Lehman, Bruce Elder, Taka Imura, Abigail Child, Andrew Noren, and too many others. Many others all over the world. And they took their Bolexes and their little 8mm and Super 8 cameras and began filming the beauty of this world and the complex adventures of the human spirit. And they're having great fun doing it. And the films bring no money and do not do what's called useful. And the museums all over the world are celebrating the 100th anniversary of cinema, costing them millions of dollars the cinema makes, all going gaga about their Hollywoods. But there is no mention of the avant-garde or the independence of our cinema. I have seen the brochures, the programs of the museums and archives and cinematheques all around the world, but these say, we don't care about your cinema. In the times of bigness, spectaculars, $100 million movie productions, I want to speak for the small, invisible acts of human spirit. So subtle, so small, that they die when brought out under the clean lights. I want to celebrate the small forms of cinema, the lyrical form, the poem, the watercolor, etude, sketch, portrait, arabesque, and bagatelle, and little 8mm songs. In the times when everybody wants to succeed and sell, I want to celebrate those who embrace social and daily tailor to pursue the invisible, the personal things that bring no money and no bread and make no contemporary history, art history, or any other history. I am for art, which we do for each other, as friends. I am standing in the middle of the information highway and laughing because a butterfly on a little flower somewhere in China just fluttered its wings. And I know that the entire history, culture, will drastically change because of that fluttering. A Super 8mm camera just made a little soft buzz somewhere on the Lower East Side of New York, and the world will never be the same. The real history of cinema is invisible history. History of friends getting together, doing the thing they love. For us, the cinema is beginning with every new buzz of the projector, with every new buzz of our cameras. With every new buzz of our cameras, our hearts jump forward, my friends. Such a beautiful manifesto. And I want to note, by the way, that since the time that this is written, of course, we don't use film anymore. And so when he says 8mm, that was basically the cheapest kind of film. And so independent and avant-garde filmmakers who were not making films for money, this was not a popular commercial cinema. They used 8mm film a lot because it was cheapest, right? It was the smallest, cheapest kind of film for cameras. So today and for the next couple of recommendations, I really want to celebrate avant-garde cinema. And today I'm going to start off with one of the most famous avant-garde films, one of the few that is actually widely seen, and it's also one of the earliest. And it's a film named Andalou, directed by Louis Buñuel, one of the directors that was actually mentioned in that manifesto and made in 1929. And I want to read first a real brief quote written by Louis Buñuel on this film. Quote, "In the film, the aesthetics of surrealism uh, are combined to some of Freud's discoveries. The film was totally in keeping with the basic principle of the school, which defines surrealism as psychic automatism, unconscious, capable of returning to the mind its true functions, beyond any form of control by reason, morality, or aesthetics. That's going to sound probably a little bit confusing to you, especially if you're a big beginner kind of to the history of art and cinema. So let's dig a little deeper and let's just break this down one by one. So let's start with surrealism. Actually, let me first start with who the hell Luis Buñuel was. And Luis Buñuel was a Spanish filmmaker. He's really an extremely revered director. He's considered the greatest director of surrealism. And he was born in Spain, but he actually made films really all around the world. For instance, on Andalou, this film was made in France, which is actually why it's called Andalou, which is a French title. And the French actually translates to English as an Andalusian dog. Andalusia is a region in Spain. Now, what does that name mean? An Andalusian dog? It actually means nothing, literally nothing. I'll get to that in a second. But Buñuel was a member of this extremely influential early 20th century art movement called the Surrealists. And he was really a key member in this art movement. And unfortunately, in the 30s, Spain had a civil war. And so at the time, many artists were actually moving around Europe, Spain to France. And so he was making films in France and Spain. But in the 30s, when the Civil War happened, one side in the Civil War was a fascist side. And so the fascists actually end up winning the Civil War. And Spain actually was ruled by a fascist dictatorship for several decades. And so for this time, Buñuel actually had to flee Spain and come to Mexico and the United States. And so he really made films all around the world, in France, in Spain, in Mexico, and in the United States. Unfortunately, because of political circumstances. And so now let's take a look at what Surrealism was. So like I mentioned, Surrealism is this early 20th century movement in art. So it's not just in film, it's across all the arts. And it is fundamentally a reaction or really an adoption of these extremely innovative, fascinating new philosophies that had come out of this scientist / philosopher Sigmund Freud. Now today in science, especially the psychology, which he helped really kind of found modern psychology, Freud is not taken seriously anymore. And indeed, even though Freud considered himself kind of as both a scientist and a philosopher, you can see even from his writings that he was not a very good scientist. He was not a very disciplined scientist. And certainly his experiments, or so-called experiments, are there's no control, right? Scientists today would not accept them as fact or as solid science. But as a philosopher, Freud remains really, really powerful. He remains an influential philosopher. And if you try and read Freud, not as a scientist, but as a philosopher, you can really see why. Because Freud's core idea is in contrast and in reaction to the philosophy that came before him in the West, which is that, fundamentally assuming that people can make rational decisions, right? That the logic, the arguments, the things that we do are a result of our rational reasoning. Freud says no. And this is what is really revolutionary about it. Freud is one of the first people, really the first generation of philosophers to say, no, maybe we don't think rationally. And maybe there's very large philosophical, ideological implications that because we don't think rationally, the way we think can actually be influenced by society, by politics, by all these kind of biases, right? Maybe it's these biases that we don't really recognize that have a deep influence on what our thoughts are. Now, this is kind of obvious to us today, right? That of course, right? If you're going to be If you're on a particular political side, you're going to be biased, or you'll have biases in your opinions from your family or from where you come from. This is kind of obvious, and it's assumed to us today. It wasn't before, and Freud was really this revolution in thought, and his whole generation gets kind of called the hermeneutics of suspicion, because they were suspicious that people really could have these purely rational thoughts. And so here, this illustration is one of Freud's core ideas, that Freud compares the mind to an iceberg, because our conscious mind is only that little part that juts out. Most of the iceberg, and indeed most of our mind and most of our decision-making process, most of our thoughts, actually come from the unconscious. Now, even though Freud's science is now debunked in psychology, psychologists actually largely agree with this general idea that most of our thoughts actually do come from unconscious, or they're influenced from the unconscious. So ultimately, I think you can boil down one of Freud's key arguments to: we are not in control. That's a fundamental assumption that still today so many people have, right? Even though our way of thinking and talking today is influenced heavily by Freud, we still assume that we're in control. We're in control of our lives, we're in control of decisions and thoughts. Freud says, no, we're not in control. And it's this influential, kind of revolutionary idea that impacts the surrealists so much. In fact, one of my former professors liked to say that the surrealists basically took Freud's writings and they just painted what was on the page. So the surrealists really were fascinated by Freud, and they tried to depict the unconscious. So realizing, right, reading Freud and going, wow, actually, maybe it is that we're not in control. Maybe it is that most of our thoughts come from the unconscious, that we have these unconscious drives. They wanted to kind of explore the unconscious in art and try to, get a glimpse of it through art. And just as one example of this, we can look at this game that they invented. The Surrealists invented this game called the Exquisite Corpse. They would play with each other as a kind of artistic game that would look into the unconscious. And it would kind of simulate unconsciousness by forcefully removing information and forcing you to decide what to put into these drawings. So the Exquisite Corpse game is fundamentally that a group of people have to create one drawing. But so normally if a group of people collaborate on a drawing, they would just, maybe just paint together or something. But in this case, they purposefully withhold information so that each member of the group has to decide what to put into the drawing with a very limited amount of information, forcing them to kind of rely on their unconscious mind. And so how they do this is, you can see in this first part, so they first have the first participant draw part of the drawing on the very top, and you can see that the top there looks like it's one complete drawing, but then they fold the paper so that most of the top drawing is obscured to the next person, and they leave only the bottom part of the top part of the drawing visible to the next guy, and then they pass it over to the next guy. So the next person can only see the bottom portion of the drawing so far, but they have to add on the next section, only seeing that little part. And then they fold it again. So then whatever the second person drew, the third person that gets past the drawing can only see, again, the bottom part. And so this way, they only get limited amount of information. They have to add on, and they unfold it, and they find this like completely delirious drawing. So this way, they're kind of delving into the unconscious. And the technique that the Surrealists developed to try and delve into the unconscious at first, it was called automatism. And automatism is basically where you get a basic idea for a drawing or painting, a work of art, but instead of actually relying on traditional kind of the rules, right? Instead of relying on the techniques that are taught at the academies and that these artists did know, right? These artists were classically trained, they were trained in academies, They knew how to paint in a traditional way, but they purposefully decided to forget those. And so they had an idea for a work of art, but instead of actually just using, the ways that they were taught, they just let the pencil or the brush go however it went. And they just kind of let go and just let it move on its own. They knew what they wanted to paint or draw or create. They just didn't, put too much emphasis on thinking about it. They just try to think about the least as possible and just let it do its thing. And so here's an example of an artist who was really a pioneer in this automist technique. He made a lot of paintings and sculptures and drawings with the surrealist automatism. And this is an example of one of his works, Naked Woman Climbing a Staircase. And you can see that there's these kind of crude, purposefully strange drawings. He tries to let his unconscious mind, as well as some of his biases, right? Freud says that the unconscious mind, what he calls the id, is actually comprised of all these drives, these fundamental drives. These drives drive us toward either life or death. So some of those drives toward life include drives towards sex. And so that's why you can see that kind of in this drawing, the nipples are enlarged. And also, if you look closely, kind of an unpleasant thing to look closely at, but the genitalia of this woman is also enlarged to kind of a grotesque degree. So that's kind of, he's trying, Juan Miró here is trying to rely on his unconscious and trying to delve into his urges, right? Those unconscious drives. But interestingly, to the film that we're going to look at today, Chien, Andalou. So we know about surrealism now. We know about what psychic automatism means. This film was not made by Luis Buñuel alone, as most films are not made by one person alone. The person who collaborated the most with Dali on this, with Buñuel on this film is actually the most famous surrealist artist ever, Salvador Dali. Dali had a very close role he had a very important role, on this film. He didn't direct. Buñuel was, the key force, but Dali was really there at every step of the way. He actually appears in the film, and he assisted in writing and kind of contributed ideas. And Dali actually uses a very different technique than automatism. It's sometimes called verism, because you can see in this painting on the right there by Dali, the Ghost of Vermeer of Delft, which can be used as a table, which in itself is already a very nonsensical kind of surrealist title, which, by the way, now you can understand why Chien, Andalou is kind of a nonsense title. It's purposefully nonsense, right? It's purposely trying to be unconscious, not appealing to logic or rational reasoning. It's kind of just trying to rely on the unconscious mind. But in this painting, it's based on a painting by the great artist Johannes Vermeer, but made, again, delirious, nonsensical, because nobody's leg looks like that, right? This is actually based off of a likely self-portrait of Vermeer painting, right? But Dali takes a leg and just stretches out and turns it into a table, right? This is the kind of thinking that could only be done if you just completely let go of rational thinking and just completely surrender to the irrational, unconscious mind. But Dali goes a step further than automatism, because automatism is you have an idea and you just try to surrender your thinking over to the unconscious in the execution of that idea. But Dali actually pioneers this method, what he calls a paranoid critical method, where you're not just trying to surrender the execution, you're actually trying to surrender your entire being, your entire psyche over to paranoia. And really, this is more than just a technique of creating art. It's kind of a research, right? So, because Freud is saying that, look, there's this really huge, fascinating part of the psyche that we didn't realize. That was really the most important part of our psyche, as the unconscious mind. Well, and then Miró is saying, oh, cool, let's use that to make art. Well, Dali is saying, let's go a step further and see if what kind of art we'll make, what kind of creations we'll create, how we'll be thinking if we completely surrender ourselves to it, right? Not just see what kind of art we make when we are in contact with it, but what if, for the purpose of research, of experimentation, we completely let go of our conscious mind and we made ourselves insane? So Dali's paranoid critical method is literally, instead of just in the conscious world, you think of an idea and then try and use unconscious to create it, you move yourself completely into the unconscious world. You purposefully try and kind of force yourself into a state of total insanity. You force yourself into temporary insanity. And so it's a kind of courageous, but also kind of screwed up a way of research, because no one really did this before, right? No one had attempted this. And so it is a fascinating kind of research. And interesting enough, the most clear and precise and respected analysis of what exactly the paranoid critical method was, how Dali did it, was actually written not by an art historian or a theorist, but an architectural theorist, an architectural scholar, or he was at the time a scholar, but today he's actually a very well-known architect as well. And his name's Ram Koolhaas, and it's in his book, Delirious New York. So I'll just read you a small excerpt from his book where he introduces and kind of explains what the paranoid critical method is and how Dali practiced it. So I'll read you this now. This is from page 235 of his book, of Delirious New York. And he starts with a quote from Dali. And by the way, a lot of these are actually quotes from either Dali or other sources. So quote from Dali: "I believe that the moment is at hand when by a paranoid and active advance of the mind, it will be possible to systematize confusion and thus help to discredit completely the world of reality." End quote. In the late 20s, Salvador Dali injects his paranoid critical method into the bloodstream of Surrealism. It was in 1929 that Salvador Dali turned his attention to the internal mechanism of paranoid phenomena. And so note here, we're talking about insanity. By paranoid phenomena, we're talking about Dali becomes interested in how people who are actually insane think. Because Freud argues that insane people, right, people who have some sort of mental condition, what is actually happening is that they've lost control of their conscious mind and they're kind of being controlled by their id. They're controlled by their unconscious. So they can't control their urges for sex or for killing, that kind of thing. And so Dali becomes fascinated by this. So Dali turned his attention to the internal mechanism of paranoid phenomena, envisaging the possibility of an experimental method based on the power that dominates the systematic associations peculiar to paranoia. Subsequently, this method was to become the frenzied critical synthesis that bears the name of paranoid critical activity. The motto of the paranoid critical method, PCM, is the conquest of the irrational. Instead of the passive and deliberately uncritical surrender to the subconscious of the early surrealist automatisms in writing, painting, sculpture, Dali proposes a second phase surrealism, the conscious exploitation of the unconscious through PCM, paranoid critical method. The PCM is defined by Dali mostly in tantalizing formulas. Quote, the spontaneous method of irrational knowledge based on the critical and systematic objectifications of delirious associations and interpretations. End quote. It is easiest to explain the PCM by describing its exact opposite. In the 60s, two American behaviorists, Ilon and Azrin, invent a reinforcement therapy, which they call token economy. Through the generous distribution of colored plastic tokens, inmates of a particular insane asylum are encouraged to behave like normal people whenever possible. The two experimenters posted a list of desired behaviors on the wall, and then gave bonus points, tokens, to those patients who made their beds, swept their rooms, worked in the kitchen, etc. These tokens were redeemable for canteen items or for amenities such as a color TV, staying up later at night, or a private room. These incentives proved very effective in motivating the patients to look after themselves and take care of the ward. The hope that underlies such therapy is that sooner or later, such systematic simulation of normality will turn into real normality, that the sick mind will insinuate itself successfully into some form of sanity, like a hermit crab into an empty shell. Dali's PCM is a form of reinforcement therapy, but in the opposite direction. Instead of the diseased performing the rituals of health, Dali proposes a tourism of sanity in the realm of paranoia. So if that makes sense to you, basically what he's doing is just like how those behaviorists gave tokens to try and reward people and thus incentivize people to make themselves behave in a more sane way. Dali is incentivizing himself to behave in a more insane way and thus kind of forces himself, trains himself, conditions himself into actually becoming insane, into trying to, into moving a psyche, into thinking exactly like a paranoid person. So even though Luis Buñuel says that he's totally following automatism, psychic automatism, Dali has a role in this, and I think, what's interesting is that if we collate this with another source from Buñuel, I think he has a very close relationship to paranoia as well, because, or the paranoid critical method. Because very clearly, Buñuel's film on Andalou is not just kind of blind creations of automatism, right? Not just blind improvisations. Rather, they're a concentrated, continuous attack on reality. Remember, Dali here is trying to totally discredit reality by moving completely into the irrational, conquest of the irrational. And likewise, Buñuel here, this film is totally insane. And it is totally an assault on the senses, assault on everything that on social mores, on acceptable things, right? It is violent, it is sexual, it is nonsensical, but not in just an improvisatory way. It is a concentrated way. So I think it goes further than Buñuel even likes to admit. And so I want to look at Buñuel, another writing by Buñuel, kind of to complement a description by Koolhaas, a very great description of the paranoid critical method, where Buñuel basically announces his allegiance to the paranoid critical method. And I think it's very easy to try and enjoy Andalou as kind of just a film that, it's really weird. It's really cool because it's weird. And just look at those images of weirdness. You go, whoa, that's really cool, right? This is a movie to watch on acid. That's not how Buñuel wants you to watch this film. Buñuel wants, and in fact, Buñuel doesn't like it when you do that, right? Buñuel argues that this is not the movie for acid trip. This is not the pothead movie. This is not, this art that is just supposed to be weird. This is an art that is supposed to make a point. A political point, a revolutionary point. And the point is this assault on reality. It is supposed to be a concentrated assault on reality. So I'm going to read this very, very short writing. It's only just 2 paragraphs long. It's called Preface on Andalou. It's from 1928. And he's basically saying what he intends you to read this film as. So this is by Luis Buñuel. The publication of this screenplay in La Révolution Surréaliste, and the screenplay that he's publishing is, of course, Andalou, is the only one I have authorized. It expresses, without any reservations, my complete adherence adherence to surrealist thought and activity. Un Chien Andalou would not exist if surrealism did not exist. A box office success. That's what most people will think. That's what most people think who have seen the film. But what can I do about those who seek every novelty, even if that novelty outrages their most profoundly held convictions about a sold out or insincere press, about which this imbecilic crowd that has found beautiful or poetic that which at heart is nothing but a desperate, impassioned call for murder? So he's saying this isn't supposed to be box office success. It's avant-garde, like Jonas Mekke said, it's not commercial. He's making it because he wants to. He's passionate. It's a box office success, or it's not supposed to be a box office success, but it's not supposed to be beautiful or poetic either. It's supposed to be a desperate, impassioned call for murder, right? It's supposed to be a total insanity. If anything, it's supposed to offend, right? But this is a fascinating film. It is a wonderful film. It's a masterpiece by one of the really revered kind of old masters of cinema that every film school student kind of comes out knowing about. And I hope you enjoyed the film. I hope you enjoyed this little talk and the readings that I read out. I really encourage you also to read the entirety of Rem Koolhaas's book, Delirious New York. It's a really wonderful book. And if you liked Un Chien Andalou, it's a very short film, actually. I highly encourage you to look at some of Buñuel's other films. I imagine you're probably here for a longer film. So since this film is short, he made a very, very large number of other masterpieces that have been very revered as well, from Simondo Deserto to, forgetting there's that Viridiana, I think that's the title. Well, anyway, he made many, many, many masterpieces. They're all surrealist, and you can apply a lot of the ideas that I talk about here to them. So anyway, thank you for listening and watching. I hope you enjoy Un Chien Andalou, and I hope you also look up some avant-garde films, and I hope you give some attention to the avant-garde. Thank you so much.